Welcome back to Jeffro's Game Room. Today I have a long overdue project that I've been meaning to do to my PS4, and that is changing the thermal paste or cooler paste or thermal compound, whatever you'd like to call it. But either way, I've cleaned my console many times in order to help reduce the sound of the fan, and in the beginning it did work quite well, but it's getting to the point where it doesn't really do all that much. So the solution now is to change the thermal paste on the APU and see if that is going to help us at all. But to get started, we're starting with a Torx T9 security bit. This is essential unless you want to mess around with tools that aren't going to work. This is the best way to go. Like I said, I've taken my console apart multiple times in the past. So the exterior plastic on my console is gonna be removed relatively easily. If you've never taken your console apart before, you may find that the clips are still in really good condition and they still hold on quite nicely, and it may be a little more of a struggle removing the plastic shell of your console. So just be patient, take your time. I mean, if you break a clip, it's really not a big deal as long as you're putting all the screws back in. There's no reason for anything to be falling apart or anything like that. But we've got the top part of the shell off. We'll work on the back. We've already removed the 4 screws at the back of the console, which is really the only thing that holds the exterior plastic on. And once that's removed, you'll notice there's a bit of dust in there. It's not too bad because I have cleaned it recently. And from there, we can start moving on to a more in-depth disassembly of the PS4. We start by removing the power supply. There's 3 Torx screws, and then there's 2 Phillips screws, which have little ground leads attached to them. Now, if I recall correctly, that was a Phillips 1. If I'm wrong, feel free to correct me in the comments, but figuring out the proper size of a Phillip bit that you're going to use isn't really that difficult. You just put the bit on the head of the screw, and if there's any excess of play or movement, I've probably got the wrong size bit. You'll notice at the side of the power supply there is a little modular connector. I believe this provides DC power to something else throughout the console, but either way we're gonna have to remove that so we can remove the power supply. Hey, you notice here that the guys at Sony didn't really design the console to keep dust and contaminants out of it, because every time I take my PS4 apart, there's always tons of dust inside of it. But either way, we're going to move on to removing the power supply. It can be a little bit tricky. I use a small flathead screwdriver to just kind of pry it up enough so I can get my fingers in there so I can actually pull the power supply out. But this is also another one of the components that you want to take your time with. You don't want to damage anything throughout the process, because we do want it to work when we put it back together, of course. While we're in here, we're going to want to do as much cleaning as we can, and I'm using what I think is a makeup brush, but basically it came with my lens cleaning kit, which I use for a lot of things, like cleaning my lenses on my PSVR headset and many other things as well. So we're back to the Torx T9 bit. We have a lot of screws to remove so that we can get to the motherboard. And once we're reach the motherboard, we can start to get to the meat of the potato. We will also have to remove the hard drive as well, and no reason to be concerned about losing anything as long as you've turned off your console properly. There will be no worries in regards to damaged or corrupted data or damaging the hard drive itself. Just be careful with it. It's not something that you want to drop. Hard drives are very delicate, and if you do drop them, there's a pretty good likelihood that you're gonna wreck it and it will no longer be usable. So, like I said, just handle it with care and just be gentle. Don't drop it. Like I said earlier in the video, we'll be taking our time to make sure to do a good job cleaning things. Alright, we're done with that, and moving on to the APU pressure plate, and we're back on the Phillips bit. And basically what this does, it puts pressure on the APU and secures the heatsink to the APU, making sure that the heat does transfer to it. And that's where the basically in between that is where the thermal paste will sit. Now that that's taken care of, there is a sneaky Phillips screw that I almost forgot about, and if you don't remove this screw, it's not going to release the motherboard from the chassis of the console. Alright, now we can remove that metal plate, and you can see on this here there are a bunch of black pads. These are thermal pads, and in my personal opinion, I think it's best to keep them where they are. If one is on one side and the other one is, you know, there's another one stuck somewhere else on the motherboard, just keep them where they are. Messing them with them could potentially damage them, so if they are staying where they are, just keep them where they are. Now we just need to remove some of the wire connectors and the ribbon cable for the Blu-ray drive. And once we've disconnected all of the wires, the first one we disconnected was the Bluetooth antenna, just kind of a socket connector. Second one is more of a modular wire connector, pretty common, I guess you could say. And the last one is the ribbon cable. The ribbon cable, you want to take extra care. It's not something that you want to damage. And there is a little silver tab that you need to push down on. And if you don't, you'd definitely be prone to damage the connection. We've gone ahead and removed that nice and gently without any problems. Yeah, this is the most that my PS4 has ever been disassembled, so we definitely want to take the time to get all that dirt and grime out of there, because we haven't been able to in the past. And the last thing that is holding down the motherboard is another small connector, one that you want to be very careful with. I use a flathead screwdriver to just kind of gently pry up to pull it out of its connector. It does kind of look like a connector that you would pull out sideways, but it needs to be pulled directly up, and gently, of course. But now that we've got that removed, we have successfully removed the motherboard from my PS4. And having a closer look at the thermal paste, it is everywhere. Most of it is off to the side, and when it's off to the side like that, it's really not doing a good job to transfer the heat over to the heatsink, which is what we are currently looking at now. So we will go ahead and put the motherboard aside, and we can have a closer look at the heatsink block there, and you can see there's some thermal paste on there that we will have to clean up, and a whole bunch of dust as well that we're gonna quickly brush away. And if you guys are enjoying the video so far, or if you're finding it helpful, please hit that like. Leave a comment down below if you have questions, concerns, something I missed maybe. And then above all, I'd appreciate a subscription if you do enjoy the content, of course. But we'll continue with the cleaning process. I've gone ahead and sprayed some IPA, which is isopropyl alcohol, and using a paper towel, get rid of all the old thermal paste so that we can apply the new thermal paste. We will be applying it to the APU though. We just want to make sure that we have a clean canvas to work with. And as I was just showing there, you may have noticed that a lot of it is dried up and it's quite crumbly, so that actually kind of made it easier to clean up in a certain sense, I guess. But with a job like this, you want to have the proper tools. I've got a bulb that you squeeze and it will blow air. We've got the brush for brushing away a lot of dust, and then we've got a toothbrush for slightly more abrasive way to clean things. You'll notice by the time I'm done cleaning this particular spot, I didn't get rid of everything. It's because some of it seemed kind of like it was baked on, because there is quite a bit of heat that does go on in this particular spot. The APU is the brain of your console, so it produces a lot of heat. It's doing a lot of things, and that's why it's important to keep it cool. So if you have similar issues with your PS4, maybe simply cleaning it isn't going to do the job, and you need a more in-depth fix such as this. And if you're paying attention, you may notice that there are thermal pads right next to the heatsink block. And like I mentioned earlier in the video, it's best to keep these wherever they land. You may also notice that one looks like it's missing. It's not actually missing, it's just on the motherboard. So like I said, wherever it is, just keep it where it is, and you're less likely to potentially damage it. Alright, we are done with that side cleaning wise. We'll move over to the other side, do a little more quick cleaning, and give some attention to the fan, of course, it does like to pick up a lot of dust and tends to get stuck to the blades of the fan, and best to get in there with a brush or a Q-tip or something like that and loosen it up so that we can remove it. Back over to the motherboard so that we can do a little more cleaning. Make sure we get as much of the dust and grime off that we can. And then we will start working on cleaning away the old thermal paste. Now, I certainly don't recommend you take a screwdriver to the APU of your PS4's motherboard, but I'm just kind of chipping away at the thermal paste to just demonstrate how dried up it has become. But that's certainly not what we're going to be using to clean. I'll mostly be using a Q-tip to get rid of the old thermal paste, and I actually didn't need any solvents of any sort to help the job along. In some cases you may find that you may want to use some isopropyl alcohol to help loosen things up and make it easier to remove, but in my particular case I didn't find that I needed it. It cleaned up quite nicely just with a Q-tip itself. I also use the air bulb to blow away any of the dried up crumbles that came off as well. Alright, so we took our time and we were able to do a pretty damn good job, if I don't say so myself. It's nice and shiny now, ready for the new thermal paste. And a nice close look at the APU for the PS4. So you've probably heard me say APU a few times throughout the video, and for those that don't know, it stands for Accelerated Processing Unit, and basically that is a GPU and a CPU combined. Anyway though, we've applied the thermal paste, and it is very important not to put too much. The rule of thumb seems to be about a pea size. So just a tiny little bit right in the center of the APU or CPU or GPU, whatever it may be. In this case it is an APU because it is the PS4. We'll go ahead and put that aside and bring the chassis of the PS4 back over so that we can start the beginning of the reassembly process. And like I mentioned earlier in the video, if you guys enjoyed the video and you found it useful, please hit that like, leave some comments, and if you're not already subscribed, please do so. Alright, we've got the motherboard back in, and I made sure to gently place it down, and that way we don't make a mess of the thermal paste. And from there we'll continue with connecting the small connector there, and then the metal shield. We'll go ahead and put that on. And if you recall, there's lots of screws to put back in, so I made sure to speed that section up so that we're not here all day. So we start with the APU pressure plate, and we won't be tightening the screws down completely. We just want to snug them down slightly, and then once we've got all of the screws in, we can make sure that the pressure plate is nice and tight. The main reason for this is because, like I mentioned, there is a lot of screws, so we want to put all of the screws in and make sure everything is lined up, because if something isn't quite lined up, then maybe one of the screws isn't going to go through its hole the way it is intended. So keeping everything slightly loose is going to make sure that everything lines up properly. We'll go ahead and put the hard drive back in. Just be gentle, make sure that the connectors line up, and go ahead and put the proprietary screw for the hard drive in. You'll notice that this screw has the triangle, circle, square, and X logos on it, and that is because Sony does let you upgrade your hard drive without messing with your warranty and all that. So, and now we'll continue with putting all these screws back in, and like I said, we've gone ahead and sped this section up. Now that all the screws are in, we'll go ahead and make sure that they're all nice and tight, but not too tight, of course. A lot of these screws do fasten into plastic, and it's not that hard to damage plastic, so be sure not to over tighten anything. And from there we'll move on to reconnecting the various wires and other connectors to the motherboard, starting with the Bluetooth antenna, and it has a few channels that the wire kind of feeds through, and then it goes on to kind of a socket plug connector kind of thing. I don't know the technical term for it, but that's basically what it is. And then we'll move on to that other modular wire. And I've said it a few times already, but take your time. These are pieces of the puzzle that we don't want to screw up. And putting this ribbon cable back in is much easier. You don't actually have to do anything with that tab that we had to press in order to remove it. That's strictly for removing it. But that being said, you still want to be gentle with it. Once we've got all those reconnected, we are going to go ahead and put the power supply back in. But we won't initially put all the screws back in because I want to test the console, make sure that it is working before we put the rest of the screws back into the console. Okay, bottom half of the shell is nice and clean. We'll go ahead and set the console inside of that. And like I already mentioned, we're not putting it fully back together because I wanted to test it and make sure that it is working and I didn't screw anything up before we put all the screws back in, of course. Okay, so we've tested the console and everything works, but I did forget one thing, and it was that sneaky screw that I mentioned earlier in the video that we almost forgot to take out, which would have prevented us from removing the motherboard. Turns out I also almost forgot to put it back in as well. That's why it's good to have a small little parts tray. I looked in my little parts tray and I noticed that there was a screw sitting there, and that obviously indicates I missed something, right? So also a good thing that I didn't put all the screws back in the power supply, because I had to pull the power supply back out again in order to put that screw back in. So that's a good thing. We didn't waste too much time having to go back and fix that. But we'll go ahead and put all these screws back in for the power supply. 2 of them being the Phillips with the little ground leads, and then the other 3 being the Torx T9. Okay, so the power supply is back in, all secured down. We just need to put the shell back on the PS4, and that'll bring an end to this little maintenance project that we did for the PS4. Not an uncommon problem at all to have your thermal paste going bad. When Sony makes a console, they do have to make it as cheap as possible. And oftentimes the early revisions end up losing them some money, and that's why they gotta cheap out in certain places in order to be able to retail it at a price where they can make a profit. That all being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video very much. Maybe you found it useful, or maybe you found it entertaining. Either way, I hope you guys have learned something today. Possibly, and yeah, like I mentioned throughout the video, please hit that like. If you have any questions down below, go ahead and ask. I'll leave more details in the description. For example, the model SKU for my PS4, because there's several different revisions. They're not quite all the same, so I'll be sure to put the model in the description so that you guys know what's going on. Quite a bit went into making this video, between recording, editing, doing the voiceover. all that stuff. And when you guys hit that like and you leave comments down below, it's great motivation for me to keep going. So keep doing that, guys. I appreciate it very much. And if you watched all the way to the end, in my opinion, that's the best support that anybody watching my channel can give. Thank you.